Okay, good afternoon and good evening, students. So we continue with our lecture series. We come to lecture number 7. Uh, Last lecture, you have heard some things about redundant publications, then selective data reporting, and then data misrepresentation, things like that. And I showed you certain examples of each of these uh, scientific misconducts. And I also described what is salami slicing and things like that, duplicate publications. Today, I also briefly talked to you about the publication ethics. So we'll start from that point where we left off 2 or 3 slides before we left off the last lecture. So I wonder if any one of you have any questions so far. Again, I would like to request you in case you have any questions. Any questions? Yeah, just let me unmute all of you, and in case anyone has any questions, you please put it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. That possibility is there. So you can unmute and then ask your question, but after that, please mute yourself again. Okay, there don't seem to be any questions. So let's move ahead then. All right. So I did with this publication ethics last time. So why do you come to this point? See, so far what you have seen is the problems concerning the research methodology, like what are the problems you encounter while doing your research and things like that. But now we assume that all that is over, and then you have come to the stage where you are ready to communicate your results. So why should you publish? So I have already talked to you about this. So initially you plan your research work, and after planning and all those things, you start your research work as per your given research methodology and things like that. And you start collecting data, and or in case of certain research areas, you also have to do field trips and things like that. So after that is done, then of course you have a whole set of data with you, and usually the raw data which you collect needs to be processed to bring it to a certain form, where after which you can actually start analyzing the results. So that itself takes a lot of time. So you do this analysis of your results in detail, and at the end of it, you are ready to have certain results of the analysis which you would like to communicate to some journal, or share it in some conference. So basically, what you intend to do is to disseminate your uh, results, the research results. Okay. So that is where we are now. We have now come to where now we are ready to publish and share your results. So now we'll try to see what are the problems we face from this point onwards, where most of the action takes place between the authors and the journals to which you send your publications, send your manuscripts. So again, going back to the same point, why should you publish? So at the conclusion of any research problem, we would like to disseminate the knowledge I say disseminate here because either you send it to a journal for publication, or you may be interested in presenting it in a conference, or in some other manner you wish to bring out the results of your research problem. Then another reason why people publish is because they would like to get recognition for their research work, then in the form of some awards or something like that. Then it can also help you to get positions, tenure tracks, etc. in your career. And then finally, of course, those are already in their jobs. You can get promotions based on the number of research publications or the kind of research you carry out and publish during the course of your work. So also it is important to enlighten the peer research groups. When I say peer groups, means that those people who are closely associated with the research area which you are working in, and the funding agencies who might have funded your research work, and finally the general public. Why the general public? Because in general public, they pay taxes, which in turn funds your research. So you owe this to the general public, that you should make them know that what kind of research you're doing and how it is finally ending up. Then you also do this publishing of your research work to fill knowledge gaps. So that is those areas in your research work where the areas of research work which are not clear or not known. And by doing this, you can also identify some future frontier research areas. Then you may also have what I said, out of the box or path-breaking ideas, which you would like to communicate and make people know about them. And these ideas can actually, again, direct future research areas. So, so that's the reason why you actually would like to publish. But then what are the problems, or what are the issues which you face when it comes to publication? There are certain ethical standards which are required for publication also. And why are they required? This is to ensure that the quality of your scientific publication remains high, and the public trust in your research findings is maintained. And finally, of course, people receive credit for their ideas. So whenever research work gets disseminated either in form of a publication or a presentation in a conference before a peer group, see, it has to be first validated by the concerned peer group. See, the moment you publish your research work, it may not have much effect unless someone else looks at it, some other, say, peer group or an expert group looks at your research and then validates your research and says that, yes, this particular research work has some quality or is of significance for something. So in that case, then that validation will give enough credence for a potential to shape future research or to contribute to the society. So that means, because of all these issues, it is the responsibility of the individual scientist to follow ethical practices in the entire research life cycle, leading up to the stage of publication. Okay, there are various media available for scientists to disseminate their scientific knowledge. So what are these? We have publishing houses. The popular ones are like Elsevier, for example, or American Physical Society, or even our Indian scientific societies. So these are all what are called publishing houses, which actually publish scientific journals. Or you can also disseminate your scientific knowledge in conferences. And so all these entities, the publishing houses and conferences, etc., they have certain responsibilities to follow ethical guidelines while the particular scientist's research work is published or presented in a conference. So finally, an honest publication or a publication which has resulted from an ethical research, it would go a long way in advancing scientific knowledge. It will bring new developments and will reaffirm the public's faith or trust in your research work, as well as the funding agencies' belief in your research work. And finally, of course, it contributes to the society. So here, the matter of utmost importance is that all the stakeholders in this entire chain of activity, okay, they need to follow ethical practices at all stages in order to ensure maximum benefit to all. But then that is what you have thought of, and it is good to think like that. But then the reality is rather different. This expectation, the last line which I talked about, expectation that all stakeholders should fully follow ethical practices, is rather idealistic viewpoint. So the problem is that scientific misconduct and questionable research practices are fairly widespread in research. So it is quite important that the journals and publishers of journals, they actually maintain the highest standards in publication ethics. And it is all the more important that the editors and publishers, they must impose upon themselves the best practices and standards, and they should follow certain minimum mandatory guidelines so as to ensure that the publication ethics is maintained. Suppose, okay, you have done some research work and then you have written up your results. Let's assume that we take the route of publishing your research work in a journal. So assume that you have finished writing up your manuscript, the results in the form of a manuscript, and you send it to some journal, say for example, the journal Nature. Okay. So whenever a manuscript lands up on the editor's desk, there will be basically two possibilities behind that manuscript. So either you have followed entirely during the entire course of your research work, fully ethical practices at every stage, and then written up your manuscript. That is one possibility. The other possibility is that you have followed certain unethical research practices, could be at some stage or several stages in the entire life cycle of the research, which leading up to the manuscript stage. So these are the two possibilities which lie behind that manuscript, which will land up on an editor's desk. So now what should the editor do at this point of time? See, an impersonal editor can simply say that, fine, I don't care whether this manuscript is a result of ethical research or an unethical research, and I'll simply forward it to the referees, and that's my responsibility is over at that. Such an editor is not a good editor because the editor of any journal, he has to be conscious and also concerned about whether the manuscript which has landed on his desk is the result of an ethical research work or an unethical research work. Of course, it's an extremely difficult thing for him to judge immediately, but he needs to be conscious about it and then concerned about it all the time. Okay? So if there is some way that he comes to know about it, he should immediately be in a position to take action on this. Okay? So there is a hope. It's not all unknown. There is a hope in what is called COPE. And COPE is something which is termed as Committee on Publication Ethics. And what is this Committee on Publication Ethics? It's not a committee of some people at some place or something like that. So this actually is an international platform which has been formed basically for editors and publishers of peer-reviewed journals. And this platform, it provides a certain code of conduct and best practice guidelines which are related to publication ethics. See, how did this all start? This Committee on Publication Ethics COPE, basically it was started by a couple of editors of some popular medical scientific journals, medical journals. So why did it start from the medical journals? See, the earlier days, the maximum amount of unethical practices were actually carried out in the field of medical research. Last lecture, I showed you how people were tortured during certain period of the century last time, during the war, etc., and how some inhuman experiments were carried out. So basically, the problems started from the medical research side. So, and it was quite rampant in this field. So that is why this whole matter started from the medical journal side. So a couple of editors, I think in the year of 1996 or 1997, they got together and then they decided that they must have some kind of an international platform for editors of all journals and be something like an advisory body and be a guide for these people in order to see that ethics have been followed not only in the course of the research work, but also during the publication process. So a detailed set of guidelines were drawn up for these editors of peer-reviewed journals and showed them how to deal with publication misconduct. Again, as I said, these guidelines are purely advisory in nature rather than prescriptive. And this is quite a dynamic process, and these guidelines keep evolving over time because you see, people who follow unethical practices, they don't stop at a certain point. If they are discovered and a particular unethical practice is found out, if the person remains unethical, he will try to find out other ways and means to carry out unethical practices. So these guidelines have to be dynamic in nature so as to counter these kind of unethical issues which keep evolving over time. So that is what COPE is all about. And it's a very, very exhaustive set of guidelines which these people have put together. And they have a lot of work to do because they keep getting approached by editors all the time, asking for advice on how to deal with certain particular misconducts which might have happened during the publication process. Okay. Then there was another association, it was called the WAME, the World Association for Medical Editors. And this is like COPE, but it is the spectrum of activities is rather narrow, and they are associated mainly with journals which deal with medical research. So they are a collective of editors from peer-reviewed medical journals from countries throughout the world. And they have a certain cooperation among themselves, and they keep updating their guidelines and things like that. So again, their goals are quite clear, like they facilitate worldwide cooperation and communication among editors. Then they try to improve the editorial standards, and they try to promote professionalism in medical editing through self-regulation, self-criticism, and basically education. And finally, they try to encourage research on principles and practice of medical editing. So that is what WAMI is all about. So it's like a small subset of the COPE. Okay, COPE is concerned with all kinds of journals in all research fields, but WAMI is concerned mainly with medical misconduct. Okay, so now we'll start talking about what are the possible publication misconducts. The very first thing which comes to mind in the case of publication misconducts is what is called conflict of interest. Now, what is this conflict of interest? So basically, it is the competing interests in a single person, okay, or in a single institution. Okay, and what are these competing interests? We'll see. So, in case you have a conflict of interest, like for example, okay, I'll give you just a very simple example of a conflict of interest. You go, when you're sick, you go to a doctor, and the doctor examines you and he prescribes certain medicines or drugs or whatever you call them, so that you'll get better or your health gets better. But now that's what you get to see from the doctor. But there is a possibility that the drug which the doctor has prescribed to you may not be the cheapest drug available on the market, okay? Or maybe sometimes it may not be even the best drug available in the market, but still the person has prescribed that drug to you. And why did he do this? That is because at the back of his clinic, there is someone else who comes from the pharmaceutical company and tells him that, look, doctor, if you prescribe my company's drug to your patient, probably I'll give you some benefit in the form of either financial benefit or some other benefit, inducement or whatever. So then the doctor, he is now being unethical here because he has accepted certain inducement from a drug company and he is prescribing only that drug to the patient, knowing fully well that there could be a cheaper drug available on the market and the patient could benefit from the cheaper drug also. But then still he prescribes this drug. So this is called what is a conflict of interest in very simple layman terms. Okay. But then it is not so simple all the time. So you need certain clear definitions of what these conflicts of interest are. Okay. And then what are the processes by which you can actually handle these conflicts of interest for authors, reviewers, editors, journals, and publishers. And this conflict of interest could be identified before before publication of an article, or it could be identified after the publication of an article. Okay. So these are situations which have the potential to influence people's judgments. Okay. And such situations may affect or may be perceived to affect every stage of research, from planning stage to applying or allocating funding, conducting the research, interpreting the data, and also reporting the research. And in the publishing world, the conflicts of interest can influence the peer review process, it can influence the editorial decisions on manuscripts, and also the publication management. So it is really imperative that these effects of conflicts of interest are minimized so that the objectivity and integrity of research is maximized. Okay. So the COPE definition for conflict of interest is that it is a situation in which a person or organization is involved in multiple interests, financial interests or otherwise, one of which could possibly corrupt the motivation of the individual or organization. So this presence of conflict of interest is independent of the occurrence of the impropriety. Okay. So basically, it's a competing interest, and it is anything that interferes with or could reasonably be perceived as interfering with the full and objective presentation, peer review, editorial decision making, or publication of a research article which is submitted to a journal. And these competing interests can be financial, they can be non-financial also, professional, and sometimes personal. And they can arise, these competing or conflicts of interest can arise in relationship to an organization, or it could be in relationship to another person, could be in the same organization or some other organization. So what does COPE try to do here? So the COPE guidelines, they try to minimize this effect of conflicts of interest and give certain guidelines for journals to come out with clear and consistent policies which are well publicized on conflict of interest and define what needs to be disclosed by all the parties involved. What do you mean by all parties? Starting with authors, editors, reviewers, and the publishers. Okay. So, so this has to be disclosed by all parties, including the type of the competing interest, what is the extent, and the recency of this competing interest. So how recent is this competing interest? So in all this, the transparency makes a lot of difference. And these conflicts of interest, they can actually go beyond the funding sources and commercial or personal financial gain. And then the acid test is that a conflict of interest is something that if it is undeclared but discovered later would make a reasonable leader feel cheated. Okay, that he didn't know about this earlier, and then if he had known about this conflict of interest earlier, his idea about a certain article would be totally different. So that's what it means. Okay. Okay, so how do people how do journals deal with this conflict of interest with authors? So what most of the journals, scientific journals have, when you submit a manuscript, they have a standard form which says that they ask the author whether he has any conflicts of interest regarding this research work, which is described in the manuscript that has been submitted. So it increases the author's disclosure to the editors, and also these disclosures are included in the manuscript so that the readers of those articles are well informed about this competent conflicts of interest or competent interest, if there are any. So as I said earlier, this can arise during the conduct of research itself, and sometimes in the context of publishing, they are just not restricted to the presentation, peer review, decision making, or publication. So the journals should ensure that the author's conflicts of interest are disclosed properly to the editors and readers. But then the issue is that most of the time, an unethical person, depending on the severity of the unethical behavior, he will try to get away and all those things. So ultimately, the journals will have to somehow rely on the author's honesty. And the authors are not honest, try to find them out and then try to name them and shame them. So let's see how conflict of interest can actually affect editors of journals. See, when you have an editorial board of an academic journal, each of the editors, there could be several editors in a journal. Usually there is one chief editor and several other editors. So these editors actually should carry a conflict of interest statement that reflects their past history, then their actual relationships and the positions that they have, because they can influence the editorial functions. Why does this happen? Because most of the editors of scientific journals, they happen to be scientists themselves. They may have a well-defined research program already going on. And when they have research program already going on, so there is a scope for conflict of interest. So they have to disclose what research they are doing, and how it may or may not affect their decisions. And these editors, they form very extensive networks, either with other professionals, the industries, academic bodies, other publishers, journals. And these networks and relationships, they can influence their decisions. And sometimes the subjectivity towards a set of submitting authors, papers, or an institute, and which can actually influence the peer review process. So it's a very highly complex mixture of things which finally a manuscript actually goes through. Then you come to the reviewers. Who are the reviewers? Reviewers are those people who actually review the manuscript which has been submitted and take a decision or make a recommendation to the editor that whether this particular manuscript may or may not be accepted by that journal for publication. So before that, these reviewers must disclose their own conflicts of interest. Again, reviewers are also scientists in their own right, experts. So they must disclose their own conflict of interest before a peer review process, during a peer review process, and even probably sometimes after a peer review process, so that it can prevent an impartial review. Okay. Then again, these competing interests for the reviewers could be personal, financial, intellectual, professional, political, or sometimes even religious in nature. See, for example, if a reviewer is currently employed at the same institution as any of the authors or the submitting manuscript, or he has been the supervisor, the PhD supervisor of the submitting author, okay, or a very close collaborator, or he holds grants together with him, a co-PI along with person, he should actually recuse himself from reviewing that manuscript. Because in principle, it is not correct. If you are the supervisor of the person who is submitting the manuscript, your student, your own student, see, your decision could be, you may be still impartial, but then sometimes it can happen that unconsciously your decision could be colored by the fact that you have been the supervisor or the mentor of the author. Okay, now we'll try to see the case history of a reviewer. Okay, what has happened? This is an actual case history. And of course, all of these are taken from the COPE websites. So for further, if you want further reading, you can go through this website. Publication ethics .org. So www.publicationethics.org, that is the website for COPE, and there are number of case histories which have been put up on this website. And it is really good that if all of you go through this website and apprise yourself for the various case histories, of course, it will increase your knowledge. It will also probably tell you how to cheat also, because you get to see so many, how people have cheated. But then let me tell you that even if you try to do that, you'll be caught out ultimately. Okay, there's no escape. Okay, let's see what has happened in this particular case. There was a paper which was received by some journal A in August, okay, some August of some year. And it was sent to some Dr. X for his comments and review. Now, what did this Dr. X do? He advised that the paper was not original. Why was it not original? Because he himself, or probably his own research group, has published something a little before in another journal, and therefore this study contained, and that is his study, has contained more than twice the number of subjects or the patients as the paper which has been sent to him for referring. So that was the reason he said that this paper is not original and it need not be published. But then what happened after that? The journal decided to reject the paper on the strength of this report. But 2 months later, the same person, Dr. X, the reviewer, he submitted a paper to the same journal on exactly the same research topic based on a combination of patient data from several research centers, but giving a much larger sample size than either of the aforementioned papers. So what has happened here? So the journal decided to reject the paper as it did not add enough to the previously published research. But not only that, the editor thought that Dr. X had a competing interest, and the authors of the papers who submitted in August, they may have a cause for complaint if they had known that this referee was about to submit a related article to the same journal. So the journal requires referees to declare a financial conflict of interest and ask the referees to consider declaring other competing interests, although this is voluntary. And this person, this referee X, he did not mention at that time he was referring that he was planning to submit a closely related competing article. So what should the journal do now? So then COPE has given a direction here that the referee should have declared his or her conduct conflict of interest and declined to referee that paper. So now the editor should reconsider the paper, informing the authors that the referee had behaved unethically by not stating his or her competing interests. Then there's another case history where there's a certain Dr. B who accepted an invitation to review a manuscript for a journal A. Now, this Dr. B was aware of only the title of the manuscript and the abstract. See, what happens when journals send manuscripts to referees for refereeing? What they do is they send the title of the article, sometimes the author names, and the abstract to the potential referee and ask him whether that particular referee would like to accept the invitation to referee or decline. Okay, so in such a situation, this person accepted the invitation based on the title of the manuscript and the abstract. Then this referee was also aware that he was given a time of 2 weeks to submit his review on that manuscript. Now, what happened was the review failed to materialize within 2 weeks. This person B did not send his comments on that paper. And the editorial office sent the reviewer 4 email reminders over the course of next 1 month. Nowadays, they don't even wait for that long. They give you a time of about 20 days and say if you cannot submit within the 20 days, you are simply taken off the list of referees. So they sent him reminders over the course of 1 month. Now, what happened was, without replying to any of these reminders, this referee, he submitted his own manuscript to Journal A for consideration. And then when the editorial office confirmed the acceptance of this manuscript, they also reminded him that they had to yet receive his earlier review of that manuscript. But then this person did not respond. And when the editors looked into this person's paper, Dr. B's own paper, it became very clear that there was a significant degree of overlap with the contents of Dr. B's paper as well as the manuscript which he was supposed to review. Okay, so while the editors did not really feel that Dr. B had actually plagiarized the review manuscript, okay, they were quite concerned that he had acted unethically. Okay, he accepted the invitation to review, okay, which was in a very similar area of research to his own laboratory research, and which he was also planning to submit a manuscript on the same topic. Okay, so it was they felt it was unethical, and it is the journal's expectation that professionals in this situation should actually decline to review in order to avoid a conflict of interest. Now, this was concerning with editors and how editors deal with conflict of interest. Now, this can also hit, this conflict of interest problem can hit the editors also. See, there was a case of a journal which specializes a very highly specialized field of coverage. This journal does some kind of a medical, it was some sort of a medical journal, and it concerns with one particular kind of treatment of some disease. And it so happens that that's the only listed journal that is widely accessed in Europe by people who use this kind of treatment in their course of research. And there's no other international journal which can give a suitable alternative for this journal. So, and in US, one journal most similar to this is much less specialized and not accessed or available in Europe. And the editor of this journal is also a leading research in this form of treatment. So see, this problem happens when the field of research is so narrow that first of all, there are very few people involved in this research, a very highly advanced form of research in a very narrow field topic. Okay. So the editor of that journal happens to be a leading researcher. Because he is also doing a leading research in the same field as that journal, he has a clear conflict of interest in deciding whether to submit himself as an author, okay, a report of original research to his own journal. So then he wants to know from Cope how to deal with this. That look, I'm a leading researcher, I do work in this area itself, and this happens to be the only journal in which I can publish my work, and I'm the editor of this journal. What should I do? So currently that journal's peer review policy is that it should have 2 reviewers, and at least one of them should be an external reviewer. So it should be very clearly possible to change this to 2 external reviewers instead of having 1 internal. Both can be external reviewers. And then, but sometimes even when you consider external reviewers in this particular case, because such a narrow field of research, that a conflict of interest can exist even in the choice of the external reviewers. So the issue basically revolves around whether it is acceptable for editors to publish their own work in their own journals. Okay, if it is possible, acceptable, then of course the review process must be made as transparent and as difficult or rigorous as possible. Okay. So the final guideline which was issued by Cope is that provided every effort is made to minimize any bias in the review process by having another associate editor handle this review procedure independently of that particular editor, recognizing it would be impossible to remove this bias completely, and the process is absolutely transparent, then this would be the most appropriate route to take. As an extra precaution, if and when the article in question is published, the editor might like to publish an accompanying commentary, okay, showing how transparent the reviewing process had been in spite of his conflict of interest. So that was the final guideline which was issued by Cope. Then there was another case where the associate editor, who is lower than the chief editor, okay, he received a letter claiming harassment from an author that the editor of that journal was harassing him. The author had submitted a manuscript which was repeatedly sent back for changes in format, but not rejected. And eventually the author withdrew the article and submitted it to some other journal with a good impact factor, and it was accepted immediately with high priority. So then he informed the editor and the associate editor of this irregularity, and he suspects some foul play. So the associate editor informed the editor that there was some conflict of interest as another similar manuscript from another author, which was close to the editor, which was under review process, but he was asked verbally to stay away from the matter. The editor refused to discuss this matter in the editorial board meeting, and he also threatened to suspend the associate editor. See, this is something similar to the case which I discussed about the famous Rajput case, where when it was discovered, the person who blew the whistle on this plagiarism of Rajput's paper happened to be a faculty member in the same university, and a faculty member was suspended. So does this constitute editor misconduct? And if it does, then what is the course of action? Is there any ethical binding on the associate editor to have the matter investigated further? So here the committee, that is COPE, agreed that the associate editor did have an ethical responsibility to take action, but to take the pressure off from this person, it was suggested that any member of the editorial board could raise the issue and press for a discussion at the board meeting. And the board has an obligation to ask the editor-in-chief for an explanation of his actions. And if there is no satisfactory explanation, the next step would be to contact the society, that is the people who run that journal and who are owned by the society. So it should contact the society committee. And then the associate editor could ask them to investigate this matter. And another advice was that the journal should formulate a specific policy on conflict of interest, that in future such issues may not actually arise. So these were all where it was known that there was a conflict of interest. But sometimes these conflict of interests are not known immediately. And they come to light after the publication of a paper, okay? And because of which the editors have been unwilling or uncertain of the process to issue a correction. Because it has already, the publication process has happened, it has been published, and then some undeclared conflict of interest came to light, and editors are sometimes unwilling because they don't want to accept the fact that they have been cheated by the authors, or they have been not good enough in trying to review the paper and things like that. So now what happens is that if during the peer review itself, the reviewers, they suspect some undeclared author conflicts of interest, they should immediately inform the editor, who will again follow the relevant COPE flowchart, which will tell them how to continue with the review. And if the readers of this published article, they can also report some possible undisclosed conflict of interest, and the journal should follow certain procedures and issue a correction if appropriate, or even sometimes a retraction. See, this undisclosed conflict of interest can be discovered by readers also. Okay, so I'll show you how it happens. Because sometimes you publish a manuscript, some paper in a journal, and it is read by a person who knows that author, who knows the background of that author, who knows what the author does apart from his research work, what he is involved in. He will immediately know what are the things going on behind, and he would guess that if there is a conflict of interest which is happening, and so this is so and so is the problem. And so such readers, they can actually inform the editor and tell him that, look, this was the problem behind this manuscript or paper, and you must investigate further. Okay. So how does this happen? At the submission stage, you can have a flow chart, which is something like this. Okay. First, the reviewer informs the author, okay, the editor of that manuscript, that he informs the editor that the author may be having an undisclosed conflict of interest. So what does the editor do? He will thank the reviewer, and then he will start his investigation. So how first he will contact the author, and he expresses concern that, look, there could be a certain conflict of interest here, okay? And then there are two things which are possible after that. The author supplies those relevant details which are asked by the editor, or the author denies that there is a conflict of interest. So if the author denies that there is a conflict of interest, but the editor is pretty sure about it, then the editor has to explain the policy of the journal and the policy concerning conflict of interest, and then obtain a signed statement from the author that they are clearly following the journal's policy on conflict of interest. And if the other case, the author supplies all the details, then of course you can take this into consideration and amend that conflict of interest statement, go ahead with the review, and finally inform the reviewer of the action taken, so that the reviewer can actually go ahead with the review of the manuscript. So this is at the submission stage. Now, the conflict of interest, if it happens or discovered after the publication, what should be done? Okay. Here again, some reader informs the editor that the author has an undeclared conflict of interest. And then, of course, what happens is that the editor again contacts the author, and then again, there are two cases. The author replies and supplies the relevant details, or the author replies and denies that there is any conflict of interest. Again, it is the same thing. You go ahead. If the author gives all the details, you go ahead and look at the seriousness of the conflict of interest and reassess the article based on that, and then further again take a decision whether this conflict of interest really affected that article or peer review. And if it has affected, then either some post publication errata or something like that, or sometimes even the severe case, you can actually retract that paper. In the other case, if it is not affecting the outcomes, etc., you simply publish a correction to the conflict of interest statement and then inform the readers that this is the particular action which has been taken. Okay. And then in the other case, when the author denies any conflict of interest, it's a little more detailed. So either you make an investigation and find the conflict of interest, or you decided there is no conflict of interest, and then in such a situation the publication stands, and then the reader is informed. And if the conflict of interest is found out, it goes back to this line again and then follows this path. So that is how a conflict of interest before and after publication is dealt with by the editors. So what are these undeclared conflicts of interest? Let's see a particular case history. Now, there was a published study which reviewed the use of certain devices for performing a clinical maneuver. So it was some instrument. Okay? It reviewed some instruments which actually did some particular clinical maneuver. And it was found that one of the authors, he actually worked for a consultancy, but he declared that he had no conflict of interest. Then later the journal receives a letter pointing out that the consultancy has been set up explicitly to persuade governments and the regulatory organizations about the virtues of new drugs and technologies. So, because this person was working for that consultancy, the editors felt that this was a conflict of interest that should have been made known to them, declared before before the publication. And then, of course, they asked the author whether he agreed with this. The journal's advice is that if there's any doubt, authors should declare an interest, as there are rarely any problems taking this approach. Then the author explained that he had moved jobs after carrying out the research and writing the paper, but before the peer review and publication process had occurred. So he cited his current address as being the place of contact. So the journal probably was considering publishing an emphasis of undeclared interest, but is there anything else it should do? See, many authors are sometimes they are unclear about what actually constitutes a conflict of interest. They may not be aware about it at all. They may be happily working for someone else, but they may not be aware that it actually constitutes conflict of interest. So there has to be a proper balance which has to be struck between what exactly should or could be declared. And then the journal need not take any further action other than what suggested by the editor here. And you should consider publishing an editorial in the journal to help clarify the issue for authors, for all such authors who are unsure about what is this conflict of interest. There was another case history where a paper on a controversial topic from 3 authors was published. And all the authors, they submitted forms saying that they did not have any competing interests. Usually at the end of the papers, you have a column which says that do you have any competing interests? So no competing interests or whatever. That has to be declared. So what happened was, after this was published, one of the readers contacted the editor of the journal to say that she had some clear evidence that one of the authors did have a competing interest. And that person was actually involved in certain legal cases and received financial consideration for that work. So the article related to these legal was actually related to these legal cases. So then the editor sat up and he planned to write to the complainant and ask her permission to send this letter to the author. Now the author accepts that if he had if he had a competing interest, then the journal will publish this statement. So is this okay, or should anything more be done? Because the public actually has a right to know if there are conflicting interests, and if there was any doubt, it is better to disclose. And just because the material is in public domain does not exonerate an author from declaring such interests. So the editor finally sent the complainant's letter to the author in question, after which a statement was published in the journal stating that particular author's competing interest. The another case history is that there was an author who wrote a letter for publication on the importance of doing research on a long-established drug. There was no competing interest statement, or he declared that there was no competing interest. But then what happened was they came to know that he was actually conducting a trial of that same drug, which was funded by a pharmaceutical company. So the editors approached him and asked him to declare his competing interest. And was this the right process, or anything more should be done apart from this? Here what happened was the author felt that he did not have any competing interests. Okay. It was agreed that it was beneficial to publish statements of competing interests with the paper, letter, etc. Otherwise, the authors might think that this is only an optional requirement. So this statement of declaration of competing interest was subsequently published, which mentioned that this had been omitted because of naivety. That means the author did not know, or he was not aware that he should submit this information. And the editor published a paper in 2001 on competing interests, highlighting the journal policies on the issue, which is useful for the future authors. Then there was another paper in the journal Nature, and they had to correct a paper on some fish farming after some journalists pointed out that if one of the authors had undisclosed ties to agriculture business giant called Cargill. Cargill is known in India also. So the reporter, he noted that several of the other authors also appeared to have undeclared conflicts of interest, but the journal had not taken any steps to eliminate those conflicts of interest. So a few weeks later, Nature actually decided to update its original correction to the article. This is the title of the article, which found that the practice of fish farming had become significantly more friendly to the environment than it was 2 decades ago. So it was just a small correction. But then later, finally, it turns out that the publisher correction is a 615-word statement. So this was actually published by this site called Retraction Watch. Okay, so these are cases of conflicts of interest which I dealt with, undeclared conflicts of interest, and how sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it is unintentional. Unintentional sometimes because the ignorance of the authors, people don't know about what conflict of interest means, etc. But all the same, this exists. And nowadays, journals are very, very strict about this conflict of interest problem. So at every stage, they ask you to declare that. And whatever statement you declare, that is actually published at the end of your manuscript. So finally, the readers who are the final judges of your research work, they will see that. And if any of them feels that, no, you still have a conflict of interest, the readers are, of course, free to inform the editor of the journal to take actions. Okay, so now we go on to the next topic, which is publication misconduct. And what are the issues which lead to unethical behavior, and what are the issues which lead to violation of publication ethics. So what is the publication misconduct? So whenever a scientific misconduct takes place while reporting or presenting research results, that is called a publication misconduct. Okay. So this scientific misconduct could be what I had already discussed earlier, like the FFP or selective reporting, authorship demands, and unethical reviewing, editorial bias and all this. And most of these misconducts can be actually prevented if people follow proper guidelines and proper code of conduct, not only in the laboratory, but also in the publication process. Okay. And what happens because of this publication misconduct? Basically, you harm the research community. And how do you harm the research community? People will lose trust in journals and the research which is being conducted, because they say that there's so much misconduct which is happening and the journals are publishing those papers. So what's the guarantee that these papers are, these journals are good? Then it can damage careers of people. It can damage careers of innocent collaborators also and other colleagues. This can damage the institution's reputation, because you come from certain institution and you are caught. Not only you are prosecuted, but the institution name also gets hit by this issue. And then the evidence base, okay, that gets basically corrupted. Okay. And overall, there's a waste of time, effort, and funds. And then when you consider biomedical research, which involves humans as subjects of research, this unethical kind of research may actually harm the participants. And finally, the general public, because if this is based on fraud papers and your scientific policy is based on what is published. So the scientific policy makers, they read the papers, they believe that they are correct and decide their policy. They are deciding a policy based on a paper which is a fraud. In the end, it will actually misdirect the funding and even future areas of research. Okay, probably we'll stop here. I can continue this part in the next lecture. So from this point onwards, there's another series of case histories and things like that. It takes more time. Okay, so I stop at this result of misconduct and how it affects the research community, the participants in research trials, and the general public. And I'll continue with this in my next lecture. So any questions so far, please? Anyone of you have any questions? You can either write in the chat box or you can unmute yourself and then you can unmute yourselves now and ask questions in case you have any questions. Sorry. Flowchart is not visible. Can you share the notes of that? I think very soon the PPT slides will be shared by the HBNI. So you should be
on Anuvidya portal.
Yeah, on the
Anuvidya portal.
Anuvidya portal, it will be shared, and you can download that and have a look, or you can also visit the COPE website, and you'll get enough information in the same flowcharts there. Any other question, please? Okay, so there are no more questions. So we'll continue the next lecture from this point onwards. Thank you very much.